So hello, I'm Vic Schoenbach. Today is November the 7th, 2014. I'll be interviewing Dr. David Savitz. Dr. David Savitz is a professor at Brown University, vice president for research there, a member of the Institute of Medicine, and he was a professor here and chair for 10 years. 9.5.
9.5.
Okay.
That's correct.
So what I wanted to do first, what I usually do, is start off a little bit about, where are you from,
Sure.
Where'd you go to school?
I'll give you again, we'll do the first 20 years in about 30 seconds here. I grew up in Hamilton, Ohio, between Cincinnati and Dayton. Went to Brandeis as an undergraduate. Started off in medical school after that at Ohio State for a year and a half. And realized that medicine was not for me, although I liked health, I liked science. Didn't have any interest in doing clinical work, and discovered the Department of Preventive Medicine at Ohio State as there was a whole menu of places I looked at for those interested in health but don't want to be physicians. And I started off, I was doing sort of more health behavior because I'd been a psychology major, and then I really remember pretty distinctly of the first, even though I took an epidemiology course, I didn't really get it. And then I remember someone giving a talk, and they were looking at drinking water disinfection byproducts and cancer along the Mississippi River. And it finally sank in how you can use these tools to look at the etiology of disease. There were cancer maps, and it was very basic sort of etiologic work, but it just became fascinating, and at some point in that process I figured I really do want to get my PhD in this. It sort of went from non-specific public health to very specifically epidemiology. Then I went to University of Pittsburgh for my PhD and on from there.
Great.
I can fill in, like, it's not that long of a history. I was at University of Colorado right after Pittsburgh for 4 years. Came to UNC in 1985 and had a good 20-year run here.
Mm-hmm. I just want to adjust the camera.
Sure.
Because now that we've had enough of me, I want to be able to show that we get a little bit more of you close up, because it's coming out of the distance there. Good. So, what brought you to UNC?
I had always had a very positive impression of it, and I remember when I was at Colorado, I was quite happy there, but I always had wanted to sort of, the way I thought of it then, and I still think, I joined the big leagues of epidemiology. And when I thought about the places that were, at that time at least, the strong institutions, of course Harvard and Johns Hopkins and so on, this was clearly the one that seemed like it was in a place I wanted to be, and sort of had an image, if you will, of being, absolutely, high-end, top of the field, but more easygoing and humane. And with all due respect, those are not words that are typically applied to Johns Hopkins or Harvard. Excellent, absolutely, and there are wonderful people there, but UNC always had this image. Maybe it was partially geography, but it was also, there was more to it than that, of being, very, very sophisticated and excellent in its work, but in an environment that would be much more enjoyable and hospitable.
Kinder, gentler.
Yeah, no, it is,
Yeah.
and that, I think that was true. I mean, I don't know how I got that impression exactly. I mean, there were some, I do remember, for example, meeting Carl Schei at a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl, being Carl, could not have been more just gracious and unassuming, and so here I am, some guy with a master's from somewhere doing whatever, and he, again, it just was so gracious, and it sort of added to that impression of it. But you sort of see the research that comes out, and you have a feel for it, and it wasn't, and I don't want to say it was like a well-researched impression, but these things sort of take shape in your mind in a way. Obviously, when I interviewed, I had to say, okay, let me make sure this is realistic or reasonable. Mm-hmm. But honestly, that impression, I still have that impression, so I still have that sense about it. Now it's much more empirically based. That's right. I think the reason it's stuck is because it's right. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, it was a place that I thought would be a great place to be and work, and had such a, the tradition of it, really, an intimidating sort of almost honor of being. I remember my office was next to Dave Kleinbaum's, and I of course know about Kleinbaum, Cooper, and Morgenstern. There's a very big deal. It's like, wow, this is I'm in the big leagues now. Now it's serious. So anyway, it was that transition into based on that impression, and then more data accumulated, and it kept getting better.
Mm-hmm. So Barbara hired you, is that right?
Indeed, yes. Indeed she did, yeah. I had interviewed with her, and again, I could, I don't want to spend too much time, but I could just go through the quotes from Barbara of these just very succinct, straightforward, I mean, the one I'll cite in the sort of, when I was looking at help in getting sort of started and what kinds of resources I'd need, she'd say, the way she put it, she said, well, just tell me what you need to be successful. And so suddenly it's not like, I'm not beating on the table, demanding things. It's not like I'm extracting things. Nobody's tricking anybody. They're bringing me there, were bringing me here because they wanted me to be successful. And that's the way she thought of it and the way it was approached. It wasn't, as I said, it wasn't, no sort of ulterior motives or complexities, and just a very straightforward, tell me what you need to be successful. So, I've got a bunch of Barbara quotes that I could give.
Provide them at any time. Wonderful for the history.
Okay.
Wonderful for the history.
Sure.
So what did you start off doing?
I was brought in, it was through a joint recruitment through the Carolina Population Center and the department. Dick Udry, who was the director of the Population Center, had, I guess, approached the department about a shared interest in pursuing this area of reproductive epidemiology. And I remember Alan Wilcox was the chair of the search committee. And at the time, I was really just making the transition into reproductive epidemiology. I'd been doing more occupational and environmental, some related to cancer. I had done some related to reproductive outcomes. But it was, again, something that I had discovered that was, I thought, a more exciting area, less traveled than the cancer area, more novel, more open-ended. And so I was interested in it, and I remember having to sort of convince them that that's what I really want. I remember Barbara asked me, there was a position open in cancer at the time, and so would you rather go that route? And I made the choice, which I certainly don't regret, of no, I really want to do this. I had to convince Dick Udry, and had to convince Alan that I was obviously serious about it. But it was, again, I think at the time there had been some activity in reproductive perinatal epidemiology, but not a lot.
Not much.
And it was the POP Center that really, again, a partnership that again, was the basis for my recruitment.
So you started off, did you actually create the reproductive epidemiology program here?
When calling it a program, it was, it wasn't like the development of a program in the way I would normally think of it now, of sort of, strategic plans and whatever. But in terms of the research, it was through this, I did a lot of the work early on at the Carolina Population Center. I taught in the department. Although at the time, I'm trying to think about this, I don't think I was teaching a perinatal epidemiology course, because the course I was teaching was what was Epi 201, and it was with Bob Fletcher. Bob Fletcher and I was his co-instructor for a number of years, which again was one of these honors. Bob was, again, justifiably looked at as really one of the leading figures in all of clinical epidemiology. And UNC, and this was in an era where, I'll digress just briefly, where clinical epidemiology and regular epidemiology were quite at odds. It was the Alvin Feinstein era, the holy wars period. It's us and them, it's only one of us is going to survive. One of us is right, one of us is wrong. And Bob was the embodiment of reasoned integration, best of both, bringing in sophistication. We all share certain things. We have different strengths. And so getting to work with him was really a treat that way, but that was my main teaching. In terms of the research...
And 201 was the research design.
It was called epidemiologic, it had the non-specific title of epidemiologic research methods. But the idea was that it was the course that was trying to complement the more purely quantitative methods courses. At the time, you're very heavily influenced by Dave Kleinbaum and others. And so there was an awful lot of, again, which is vital, but it was really, methods was exclusively algebra in those days. And Bob was trying to inject something into the curriculum that would bring those methods back to substantive health issues. And so it evolved, and it was always headed that way, but when you write a research proposal, which was the product of that course, yes, you need good methods, but what's the question? How are you going to do it? What are the logistics? How is the study going to work? Mm-hmm. And that was what that piece of the curriculum was intended to address, is to sort of fill in, re-anchor them in the substance of epidemiology.
So that was the one course that you taught.
That's right.
And you were doing your research primarily at the population
Mostly,
center.
although it was integrated in a sense, but yes, a lot of it was, there were collaborations there, but there were also collaborations here in the department that were getting established of, connections with the environmental area, for example. That was much more clearly based here. And I guess it was really the hiring of Andy Olshan. I don't know if you want to say that's what made it a program, but that was a pretty significant milestone in the expansion. He was very sort of squarely in the birth defects area, a little bit of childhood cancer as well, I guess, at that time. But that was sort of, now we had 2 tenure-track faculty working in the area, and so sort of.
So it was a real program.
That's right. That made it a program, because then it's sort of the when it sort of identity. I'm not saying we weren't aware of it, but. There wasn't a lot of formal programmatic areas except for cardiovascular disease.
Well, I think cancer was a program by then.
When you say a program, there was Barbara's work. Mm-hmm. There was a training grant. I think that may have been the glue that held those together. But you're right.
But you're right. It was not as organized as the CBD.
Yeah.
They were always
CBD has always been sort of the cluster that really functions in every sense, as it always did, at least, and apparently still does, as a program. The others were clusters of faculty interests. It's not that they weren't, that they were fragmented or not organized, but they weren't so clearly delineated.
They weren't as cohesive,
That's
certainly,
right.
as the CBD.
That's right.
All-encompassing.
Yeah.
So whom did you work with particularly? Any faculties? I mean, Andy was your co-programmer.
Yeah, well, Andy and I we worked together a lot, actually.
Uh-huh.
We ended up working together quite a bit on issues related to male reproductive health. As it evolved, actually, I'm thinking it's interesting in terms of collaborators. We developed this pregnancy, infection, and nutrition study. It was a big deal, and that was based.
And when did that begin?
Oh, I wish I could answer.
I thought
that.
you were chair when that began.
No. That was in the. I want to say maybe early 90s.
Oh, that early?
Yeah, it took a while to get it going. We had, I remember getting that thing funded. It took a lot just to get it launched. We owed some seed money from the Carolina Population Center. But then I ended up working with, for over a decade, very closely with John Thorpe in OB. Mm-hmm. Anna Maria Sigariz was our nutrition collaborator. She was involved from very, very early on. Later with Kathy Hartman and others, but not so much. It's interesting because there was not this sort of cluster within the epidemiology department per se. It was more, which maybe makes sense given the nature of epidemiology, it was more connecting people who were from outside it. Mm-hmm. People, as I did later projects in environmental work more, there were colleagues from environmental sciences and engineering that were the key sort of partners. But yeah, it's interesting. There wasn't like a single sort of partnership. There were like multiple relationships that sort of evolved project by project, and as the interests sort of evolved, the team evolved.
And you were also developing methods expertise.
I was what I would call applied methods. Again, I have to be careful here because it's not methods as we think of methods in terms of advanced epidemiologic methods, but always interested in trying to bring the more sophisticated quantitative methods to make it sort of down to earth, practical enough to be useful, and trying to sort of examine it and scrutinize it, and because there was always that question, which I still ask, is okay, well, that's intellectually elegant. Now, how is it going to help me do epidemiology better?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, sometimes you just have to be patient and trust that there's a pipeline there that eventually it will, but not now. But other times there were certain tools that you would sort of understand in a general way, and then so I was sort of anxious to try to find a way to at least articulate it, like to explain, maybe to myself first, but to an audience, what is it about this way of viewing the question or the problem that really, really helps in practice. I remember again, to use one example, when Ole Mietten in one of the few papers I really did fully understand on the case-based study.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that, Journal of Chronic Diseases, I believe it was. And finally understanding that the whole idea was to have a defined population with cases, and the notion of controls was sampling from the study base that gave rise to the cases.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that time, it had almost been presented as, well, you have the cases, you have the controls, and you compare them.
Right.
Without really a lot of thought to the, cases are sick, controls are healthy, you compare them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that framework, then I did a paper with Neil Pierce on, let's elucidate that. Let's talk about this now. How does this help us? And a paper we did on, control selection with incomplete case ascertainment. Well, now we've got a sort of a structure to think about it. And that was an example of where again, I have a lot of methods papers. Another one was recognizing that with misclassification of confounders, when you adjust for them, you partially but incompletely finish the job.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Very basic concept, but then examining that a little bit quantitatively. How much of the confounding do you remove, under what circumstances?
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't like conceptual breakthroughs by any means, but it was that sort of almost very downstream question of, let's put it into practice. Let's help, as I said, help me and help people like me who were well-intentioned practitioners, is the way I would say it, rather than true methodologists, but how we can sort of help bring that wisdom to bear and actually do what we do better. And that was, that was fun.
Mm-hmm.
I always needed collaborators on that.
Now, you published the methodological papers with Hermann Brenner, as I recall.
I did. I published a couple papers with him. He was one of these, this happened at UNC. There'd be these students who came on. He was here getting his master's, I believe. A German physician. He seemed like a nice enough guy, bright and all that. And then suddenly he starts writing these, when I work with him once, he approached me. It's interesting. He chose me, even though really in some ways, it's funny, maybe it was through the course, maybe through Epi 201, the epidemiologic research methods, but he was writing these things up, and I was as much as anything helping with the writing. But it's funny, in those collaborations I was often clarifying, asking questions, elucidating, and then I remember something that came up where I said, we ought to get in touch with Sander Greenland. So I was using my connections.
Mm-hmm.
So I ran it by Sander, who had, of course, 1 million edits, but said, this is really good. And so then it was sort of like, I still remained in the fray, but then there were a few papers that he and, Herman, Sander and Herman were sort of connecting on from long distance. But there may have been other examples like that, though, of these sort of, again, it was not a student, he was here as a fellow when Neil Pierce was here. Mm-hmm. And getting to work some with him and finding, it's funny, when there's people where you don't have a lot in common in the substantive area, but you share an interest in methods, there's a chance to work together on those kinds of projects. And we would find papers and ideas to pursue that way.
At the risk of leaving people out,
sure,
because there are too many to mention them all, but are there any other students who come particularly to mind?
Oh boy, there's been there have been so many. I had 19 PhD students over the course of the time I was here. It's funny, some of them I think it's a little bit of revisionist history. The ones that come to mind are the ones who have gone on to have really spectacular careers. Condé Ananth, who is professor of OB/GYN and epidemiology at Columbia, is editor-in-chief of pediatric and perinatal epidemiology. He was a refugee from biostatistics when I first started working with him. He had gotten his master's there and was not interested in pursuing a PhD there, and discovered epidemiology and just had just such unlimited energy. I could not keep up with the publications and the drafts and the materials sort of cycling through that way. Oh gosh, some of the collaborations, as I said, it's funny to call them like my students when they bring so much that is beyond what I knew with, a Kathy Hartman or there just is a ton of them that way that very often, to be honest, came in largely formed, and I would help to sort of steer them a bit. I may not have as much to sort of show of someone who came in just completely out of nowhere, clueless, and I sort of created them. It was always more they would bring in very, some of them had worked for years, some of them just had different backgrounds that they were ready for it, and I could sort of always steer and advise. But I think that maybe that is, I don't know if I'm giving myself credit or taking something away from myself, but I've always been better at helping them achieve what they came in wanting to do it rigorously, do it practically, give them the feedback and steer them, rather than sort of, figuring out what they should do. So it's like, I remember, even now I talk to a guy who's like, what does he really like to pursue? Let's see how that lines up with the menu, but sort of starting from that, just because it sounds altruistic, in part it's just laziness. I don't want to say like, well, I'll invent it for you. You've got to come with that, and then I'll help you figure it out. You've got to ask the questions, I'll answer them. And that is much easier that way, it really is.
I hadn't been in the department too many years when I realized that the secret of success for a department with its students is to get extremely capable students to come here who are going to succeed anyway.
That's right.
And then you put the stamp on them and you claim them as your success.
You don't mess it up. But I think at the margins we add something, and it's a very subtle thing. I mean, with Herman Brenner, it was probably adding the connection to Sandra Greenland. That was my contribution. But again, there's that kind of connecting and networking and sort of, it's a more subtle thing. It isn't, I picture sometimes in the harder sciences where you teach them something, you give them a skill, you educate them. I felt more like it was sort of like loosely steering them more than like educating them per se. And that must be the nature of epidemiology in part.
Now, at some point you transitioned, or else you took on the teaching of Epi 268 also.
1 year.
Just 1 year?
1 year. I was a substitute because of some juggling of faculty. They always used to joke about it. Andy always used to make such fun of me because for reasons even I don't understand, it was like record-breaking positive student evaluations in the 1 year I taught it. And it was not, as I said, I was mainly managing it. I mean, I gave some lectures and all, but that course conceptually was at the limits of my grasp of epidemiologic methods. I would pull it together. I remember Stephanie Engel still laughs at me about it when I was describing what matching in case control studies does, and was showing it algebraically, and it introduces confounding, which is to create balance, which is then adjusted. And I remember I said at the time, I said, it comes in and out of focus for me. And it's the kind of thing that, at a given day, you can say, now, how does that work? And it wouldn't be there. Other days, okay, here it is, I got it. And it works for some topics in the sense it actually may be helpful because my grasp is so marginal, when I explain it, I can really, I know exactly where they're at. You get part of it and it sort of doesn't fit. I think it's actually a challenge for people who are so advanced in methods. It's just, well, that's obvious. I mean, how could you not understand this? And so if there's any advantage I have that's in the papers or the course, it's in having really to grapple with it myself. And so maybe when I do get it, if I get it, the problem is when they want to push the bounds and say why or how, or is that like this, and how does that relate to that? I'm at a loss, but I can do my thing well.
Yeah, actually, that's a very interesting way of putting it, because in 168 I had some of that same experience. That
you pushed the
things
edge.
Were, well, no, then I got a little trouble when people pushed the edge. I was kind of remembering how it worked, and I could explain it in those terms, and that was helpful. But then, of course, if they wanted to go much beyond that, that was when I said, well, wait till 268.
No, I had that in even teaching now of where I've been involved with this capstone course of sort of using epidemiology more, and they'll want to go back and I'll give them some sort of seat of the pants methodologic notion or idea, and when they push for the sort of theoretical or even mathematical underpinnings, I can't do it. It's in glimpses. It's very and it is quite. I think just it's very different than, again, one of the UNC graduate who teaches the substantive, the advanced methods course is Chanel Howe.
At Brown?
Yeah, at Brown, who really gets it.
Yeah. And
it's, again, there's those who do and those who don't, and I think that for them the challenge is making it sort of accessible, and even making some judgments about how much do they really need for just run-of-the-mill epidemiologists versus those who are going to be like their proteges or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that my range, if you think of it in that, Charlie Poole used to talk about sort of the bucket brigade of knowledge.
Yes.
From the highest obscure esoteric to the little more practical and so on, and I'm somewhere in that bucket brigade, pretty close to the end.
That is a good analogy.
Yeah.
So, along that time, you got involved in SER in a big way, as I
did.
Remember.
Yeah, I volunteered to. Boy. I wish I should have brought my resume. I could tell you exactly.
Yeah, I meant to ask you for it, and I forgot.
We can fill that one in after the fact. But I'd always gone to the meeting. That was always my home base. And then I can't remember how I had the opportunity to become secretary-treasurer, to volunteer for that potentially thankless position. But it was actually a wonderful opportunity for me as a junior epidemiologist. Suddenly I was connected to the entire field. Everybody was sending, in those days, mailing their abstracts to me. Literally, that was the envelopes would come, and we would sit through them, and that's the way it worked. But it was sort of in, just sort of the having the affinity or bond or identity in the department, in the field. There was actually more centralization of epidemiology. There weren't as many of these specialty organizations that inevitably, that's just sort of the evolution of the field. I don't lament that, but the reality is that SER everybody went to in the field. And so it was a way to sort of establish an identity, and it was really wonderful networking that way. I mean, again, this is an illustration where, because I was secretary-treasurer, I would go to the executive committee meetings. Because I was there, I remember sitting down, Moises Sklo was the president at the time, and we were at a dinner, and Diana Petiti was on the executive committee. And we were talking about Moises was looking for some new associate editors at American Journal of Epidemiology, and he said, "Oh, David, I know you've done some really good reviews, would you consider that?" And now you could say, "Oh, I had to do the good reviews, but if I hadn't been sitting across from the dinner table from him, I don't know that I would have had that. I don't know that would have come my way." And it's just sort of again, I wasn't doing it in a sort of strategic way, but the reality is that when you get immersed in those organizations and become visible and build colleagues and contacts, it really makes a big difference. And that was, I was secretary-treasurer, and then I was member-at-large and president, and over the years, varying roles in that cycle. But that was my home organization in some ways. I've become a little more spread out myself even, but it still is, sort of the special home that way.
So, how is it that you transitioned to chair? Did you seek it out? Did it seek you out?
It's interesting. I can tell you there was a search for the new chair that identified several candidates and ultimately was unsuccessful in bringing someone here. I was actually on the search committee.
I was too. I remember that.
Okay, is that
disappointment? Yeah.
Barry Margolin was the chair of it, perhaps?
That sounds possible.
Is that plausible?
It definitely does. So.
And there were, again, a number of candidates brought through, and that was unsuccessful. This was, must have been 93 or 4, somewhere in there.
That sounds something like that, or 2 maybe.
Maybe even 2. And then when that occurred, Carl Schei was tapped and willing, kind enough, to step in as interim chair for 2 years.
Well, actually, I think he was made chair for 3 years.
Oh, that's right.
I think Michelle said, no, you can be real chair for 3 years.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's okay. I knew it was a time limited commitment, but it was a real commitment.
Well, because Carr was actually sort of on the verge of retiring at the time.
I think that is right. I think that he was not. Again, he was obviously he did a great job. He was willing, just a wonderful citizen. But it wasn't something he wasn't hungry for the power by any means either.
Exactly.
And then when they were going to search again, the decision was made in the large departments to initially ask the question of whether there were any internal candidates who would be suitable before launching a full external search. Mm-hmm. And for whether it was for budgetary reasons or whatever reasons, and that was sort of at least in that era, that was the nature of that decision. So then it was a choice. Okay, do I throw my hat in the ring or not? And once you start, again, you start thinking that way, and maybe it's a little, I don't know, it feels very presumptuous. I mean, I look at, the predecessors, and, well, why not? They can decide if I'm not right, then they'll tell me I'm not right, and we'll move on that way. But they did do it wasn't a full external search, but I remember giving a talk, as others did, interviewed by a search committee, as a small search committee, and my biggest, I had two fears really. One was that at that time I thought that the way you get things is by hard negotiation. Maybe it is still, but I've never known how to do that. I just don't know how to sort of forcefully, consciously extract things. So if it feels like that, I just don't have the will to do it. I think I know how to say what I need to be successful, to use the Barbara Halka quote, but not to sort of fight it. I was afraid, okay, I have no leverage. The other part more so was I just felt like the fear that internally coming from inside, that I wouldn't have there'd be no, the clout would be limited because I'm a familiar presence. Oh, it's just him. Or even a perception of the status quo remains. Okay, no changes now, we can go back to what we were doing. And I wanted to make changes, I wanted to, if you're going to do the job. And so that was sort of the minor ambivalence, but pretty minor, really. It was an adjustment, don't get me wrong. The first year was like, that's generous. First year was deer in the headlights, like, what, how does this work? You want me to do what? And over time, you sort of acclimate, you get used to it. But it was, I think part of it is in those kinds of jobs, the mechanisms you have available to actually do good things are not immediately obvious. It's these subtle decisions of putting resources this way or that, or doing, having this person take this on, or juggling courses, administrative things, your role in the school leadership. It was very, it made that just the nature of academic settings, that these positions are just sort of the power or authority you have. There's a word, I don't know if it's soft power, whatever, but it's sort of like you have a certain authority both within and outside the department, but it's not like a line authority. Mm-hmm. It's a general influence. Mm-hmm. And so that was interesting. It took a little while to learn that, and then after a period you start to say, okay, I think I get this a bit. And
had you been attending any of the dean's cabinet meetings before you became chair? Sometimes when Barbara would be or Carl couldn't come.
No, I don't think so. No, not that I recall. I don't think I had any official. It's interesting they were willing to take a flyer on it, because I don't think I had any specific administrative experience or credentials. I ran my own projects. But in those days there weren't like formal program leadership, that you could argue in a more structured program is a big deal. There weren't any of those. It was just sort of more just being a professor in the department. Mm-hmm. So I guess you have to ask Michelle that one. What was he thinking? But he was the one making the decisions.
He was, and I didn't ask him that.
Yeah.
Now there was one rough area that happened at about that time. That was the parasitology and laboratory practice. There were several rough areas.
Oh, okay. But that was particularly rough. That was basically, again, just briefly, what had happened is there had been a Department of Parasitology and Laboratory Practice. And that department was dissolved, Michelle's decision, and there was a difficult absorption of faculty into the Department of Epidemiology. And there were some very, there was some bitterness on the part of parasitology. There was some mismatch in the part of, even though, of course, over time we came to fully embrace infectious disease epidemiology. To be clear, these were not infectious disease epidemiologists. These were microbiologists. And so that made it at the time it was sort of there was this gap between them. Now over time, as the department embraced infectious diseases, where there's much more of that kind of healthy blurring and sort of, you think about the people that are here now and the degree to which there's overlap, but at this time there were these completely disjoint parasitology, microbiology, virology types, and then the rest of the department, which was not terribly biological. I mean, it was moving a bit more in that direction, but it was, and again, I don't want to claim there was anything, I was not able to fix that. I mean, that was structural, not to maybe let myself off the hook, but it was one of the lessons I had to learn is, there's some problems you can address. You can generally address some things at the margins. You can mitigate a little bit as well. I'll give a Michel quote. He said, look, for all these problems you face, that may have been one of the first I brought, to talk to him. He said, it's probably not the case that you can just outright fix it. It's also probably not the case that there's nothing whatsoever you can do to improve it. Okay, now you're dealing in this range. Now let's help figure out what it is what latitude you do have, and sort of not giving up on it, but don't set the bar too high. You're gonna be frustrated. I think that was sort of a very sage way to think about it. It just makes it a more, I think that one of the problems early on for myself was just going into panic mode. Oh my God, this is a mess, and it was a mess. Yeah, what do I do? What do I do?
I think I even sent you a memo. I'm not sure.
It may have. It may be lurking in there. I don't know. It was pre-email. You were using email before anybody else, so maybe it still is there, deep in the archives. But it was, what do you do? I mean, there's people who are unhappy, understandably. There is not a fix. I mean, maybe somebody more clever could have found one. But as an administrator, it's sort of that balancing good faith effort, being open-minded, seeking creative solutions, but not driving yourself crazy. You can't. A lot of it is simply finding the opening. There's some things you can't force it, but you can always be waiting for the opening, and when the opening comes, you push for it. That is not one I want to claim by any means that I fixed, although I think that Ralph Barrick's incredible success.
I think SARS helped a lot.
Well, it did. He had things going with Norwalk, and he was moving in a much more productive direction already, and then SARS, of course, it took off. But it was sort of, to a degree, and at least Ralph said this at the time, and this was just being nice, that it was a little bit of just his environment shaping him, not in a coercive way, not saying stop being a virologist and start being an epidemiologist, but sort of learning to be a virologist in an epidemiology department. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, again, that was one of the successes. Others were less successful.
When Barbara brought in the parasitology faculty, she asked me to chair this committee to bring the two together.
Oh, good luck.
We didn't. We developed a joint curriculum and things.
Right.
And things were moving very slowly, but Ralph was actually very quick to be the one to make connections with other faculty. And
he was very junior.
For collaborative. Well, he was junior, but he was also very collaboratively oriented.
That's right.
And very flexible.
That's right.
And we tried. I had conversations with Lola looking for commonalities because I was an STD.
Some are more adaptable than others.
Well, it wasn't just adaptable. It was the kind of research she was doing. Yeah. It just didn't connect
too fundamental. I think it was part of the problem.
And then when Carl took over, I think he didn't share Barbara's enthusiasm for the laboratory population connection, and so I think that's when the division started becoming less comfortable than.
It was difficult. It was. Listen, it was a difficult. It was a shotgun marriage, at least from the faculty's point of view. They didn't say this is what we would like next.
Absolutely.
And that's always hard when people are, in any setting when something happens. Either they adapt to it and and as I said, I think that's what Ralph did so well, is, okay, let's figure this out, and I think Ralph also knew, well, if it's not, I'll give it a shot. If it doesn't work, I'll do something else. He's successful.
Mm-hmm.
But it was sort of an open-mindedness. Let's see how this works, and let's play this out, as opposed to just hunkering down or just being unable to. Just even if you intend to, there has to be a certain. It depends on the nature of your work.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of the other things that happened during your chairship?
Probably some of the big ones, I think at least, are interestingly, the infectious disease work, the HIV work, with great credit to Mike Cohen, who was really encouraging that, and really came as a partner really to engage us with a very strong ID research program in the medical school, and we hired a number of people, Robin Ryder initially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think again, there's still obviously a great legacy, even if it's the cast of characters has changed. Infectious disease epidemiology is alive and well in the department. The other thing I feel like, again, there was a transition a bit. It's always been strong in methods, but I think that I would like to think that bringing in people like Charlie Poole and at the time Jay Kaufman and others really sort of, it ratcheted things up. And again, there's strong people obviously who have followed, but it was sort of an evolution in the methods, I guess. Again, it was always strong with Dave Kleinbaum, but it sort of was a new generation of methodology, I think, that was being brought in that way. I'm trying to think, if I was sort of to say other, again, there's specific programmatic areas that evolve. I really think it probably would be infectious disease, even though that's not what I do. Mm-hmm. That was probably the most dramatic shift over the period in which I was chair. Cardiovascular disease had been and remained strong. Mm-hmm. Cancer had been and remained strong. There were certain areas that were quite solid. They changed shape for sure, but those are ones that's where we went from really very little, or if not, if anything, to a really strong program in infectious disease.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's certainly become very large.
Hopefully it still is.
It is very much.
Yeah, good.
So there were other initiatives that you took also. I think I call them initiatives. I remember we had our graduate school review fairly early on in your chairpersonship, and Noel Weiss was
that's right,
on the committee.
That's a good memory. It's
occasionally it works. Spotted. Right?
Yeah.
And I vaguely remember one of the things he said was, you all could be bringing in more salary and growing your department, and you took that to heart.
Yeah, well, we were given, again, I don't know if I can give I don't have the figures, to plot, but the economic model was the school was quite receptive to expansion if the pool of external funding grew. It wasn't quite automatic, but basically, if there is an academic need to expand and financial resources to do so, that we could expand. And they allowed us to, basically, it's pooled, so it's not, it's sort of, you have a certain number of dollars and a certain number of people, and if you wanted, you could have very few people, all 100% supported. They would do a lot of teaching, it would be a small department. You could go to the extreme other end and be very highly leveraged. And it took me a while again to understand that economic model, but as we became more entrepreneurial and more successful, we were able to expand the number of faculty, the number of graduate students. And I really think that again, there's a limit to it, I'm sure, but good things happen when you have more different types of people, especially if you can actually get them working together. Mm-hmm. I think that it's sort of, I guess it's not interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary within epidemiology, of when you can connect, the infectious disease and the perinatal person and the molecular and the cancer and mm-hmm. and sort of this playing field gets bigger that way. I know that, I've talked to Andy about it, obviously you have to sort of adapt and expand and contract. You have to pay attention to the market. You have
portfolio management.
You've got to, and you've got a certain job to do, and you're trying to balance this academic mission. You can't be too risk averse, or you're going to end with a very small, very secure department that won't do a lot, mm-hmm. and nor can you be foolhardy, and so you had to sort of get that balance right. But Yeah, Noel came from University of Washington, which was way more leveraged than I would ever want to be.
Really?
They are all soft money. It's a state university. They have like a total department of like 40 faculty with 3 tenure lines.
Oh my heavens, that's more than I realized.
Yeah, it's completely out there. Hopkins is always out there. Harvard is too, even with endowed professorships. Other places are at the other end. Michigan is fully funded, and Berkeley's always been, you don't have to pay for your salary. UNC, we had the freedom to find where we wanted to be. And I remember at the time, one of the things they forced on me as chair, which actually turned out to be a good thing, was to be explicit. Which it's funny, at the time I really was not pleased with doing so, because when you're explicit you can be criticized, of course. But it was so helpful, even, I remember having to say, okay, how much external funding what's the goal here? And I said, we aspire to be about 60% overall. That's a B or B plus, okay? 30, 40%, okay, that's a C, maybe C plus, 80%, now we're in the A range. And that's, and not everybody will be there, different teaching duties, different mixes. But it's something, it's better than, and especially for junior faculty, I've learned this, there is so much of a tendency to just like, oh, we don't want to talk about that, just do what you need to do and you'll be fine. And it is actually, rather than being more worrisome, it's helpful to have able to calibrate themselves. Remember, I also had to talk about publications, which, how much are they supposed to publish? I just was talking to the reproductive epidemiology students, and I'm still quoting my own invented sort of guidelines, but I sent somebody on the tenure track, sort of 2 first authored, 2 co-authored papers a year, that's a B. I said, because I don't want to make it sound like more isn't better and worse is a disaster, but you're doing well. If you do that over a period of time and there's a cohesiveness to them, you'll be building a reputation, you'll be establishing an identity. But again, this was in an era where, I don't know if it was, I don't know what to attribute it to, maybe people were suing them for not having clear guidelines, but the university was forcing, okay, you've got to be explicit.
Oh, it was from the university, it wasn't just from Michelle?
No, the university forcing you to be explicit. And as I said, even though I resisted it, I think it was quite helpful. One of those things imposed, but good ultimately. So yeah, I think the increased entrepreneurship, it's still a matter of balancing that you don't, it's sort of, it's not only about the money, but it is in part about the money. It's another Michelle Abraham quote. Oh. He said, when somebody comes to me, he says, when they say it's not about the money, it means it is about the money. He said, that's exactly the message. This is in the Bill Clinton scandal era. He said, they're saying it's not about the sex. What they mean is it's exactly about the sex. That's exactly what it's about. And I think it was, again, Michelle is right on target, I mean, it is in part about the money, but it's not only about the money. With a lot of what epidemiologists do, it's the means to an end. And there are many questions we ask where we need the money to do it and do it properly. And if we don't get the money, we just can't go after those topics in the way they need to be pursued. So it is, it's about the product and the scholarship, but the money is the means to an end for sure.
Well, and during your years as chair, the department grew substantially.
It did.
I mean, it helped that NIH was doubling the
right.
funding.
That was a little.
You were there to get it. I mean,
you
could have let it go.
Well, I think a lot of these things, honestly, with your partnerships too. I mentioned Mike Cohen and infectious diseases, but oh my gosh, Kathy Hartman was brought in jointly with OBGYN. Steve Marshall was brought in with orthopedics. There was